Hey, this is Gary with Jolly Dolly, and I'm going to show you how to change out the transaxle, also known as the axle or gearbox, on a Jolly Dolly Power Pro motorized dolly. The first step is going to be to lay the dolly down on its belly like this and make sure that it's turned off. We're going to remove both tires using either an impact or a tire iron. The next step is to remove the motor, which is held in place by two bolts, one here and one down here. Because of the angle to access these, it's best to remove these using a 6mm ball-headed Allen wrench or a hex socket like this. This gives us different angles we can come at. Now, these bolts are going to be really tight, so you are going to have to break them loose like that. You want to completely remove the bottom bolt first because this bolt will hold tension on the motor. Now when you go to remove this one, you're going to want to lift up on the motor as you loosen it to support it, because the motor is going to want to start dropping down. Once you get both bolts removed, you can kind of wiggle the motor and push it away from the axle, and then it'll drop down here. When you take the motor off, you're going to notice there's a plastic clip here with a piece of metal inside of it. This is a coupler, and it's very important that be installed when you put the new axle on. You're going to reuse the one that came on your dolly because the axle we send you will not have one of these. Sometimes this will come off on the axle, and sometimes it'll be on the motor. So you just need to identify where it is and make sure that it gets put back on. And we can start to remove these bolts. This bolt just so happened to break off. I'm not sure why, but nevertheless, we're going to remove this foot pedal and then work on the bottom bolt. When you take these bolts off, make sure that you save the hardware that's on them and put them back in the same order. To remove the axle, you're going to want to lift up on this section right here as you lift. Otherwise, the torque is going to bind up these square mounts here. If the axle's kind of stuck in place, you can use a dead blow hammer to loosen it up. Now when you put the new axle in place, make sure these rubber mounts are all the way on. And you're going to lower it in place. You may have to wiggle on this a little bit to get it to go all the way down. Make sure both sides of the axle are fully seated. You can see here there's a gap, and that's not good. When you mount the new axle, you'll notice that it's missing the ears that normally bolt into these two holes. But that's by design to give the axle more flex so that it can absorb shock better. Your kit should come with a shorter bolt that's to put the foot pedal back in. So you want to make sure you have it through the spacer first, and it goes from right to left. Then you're going to put this big washer and then a serrated flange nut onto there and tighten that up. You can put a wrench on here if you need to. Most of the time it'll bite in enough where you don't need a wrench, and then there's nothing going in this bottom hole. So the spacer looks like this, and it should be all the way inside of that hole, and that is what keeps this tight. When you go to put this axle tie back in place, you'll notice that the hole is closer to one side than the other. So you want to match what's on the dolly. Normally the hole would be closest to the inside, and so we match that up top. Then you take your bolt, make sure you have your split lock washer on first, then your flat washer, and that's going to go down through here like this. And you're going to do the other side. You want to take your serrated flange nut and put it on the bottom here, and you want to thread that in just like a quarter turn, just enough so that it stays on there. Now this next step is a little different from the way the axle was originally mounted. We're going to take these spacers and place them right here and here. And they're going to go between this lip here and the axle tie. And what this is going to do is allow us to tighten this all the way down, but it's not going to press down on the axle as hard as it used to, which will give it some more wiggle room. So what you want to do is start tightening these by hand until you get enough pressure on these spacers, and you have to make sure you stay even left and right. You can feel how far the bolt is protruding through the flange nut. And you can start to tighten them. Make sure your spacers stay in place. If they move, you need to loosen up and then put them back in place. And as you tighten down, the spacers may move a little bit, but the end result, they should be securely between here and here with no chance of slipping out. And these bolts should be torqued down tight enough where that's not going to come out. This is what the other side should look like when you're done. You can see the spacer right there and right there. So we're going to repeat the process for the other side. Put our spacers in place. Start with hand tightening these a little bit evenly. Then go back and forth. Torque them down and make sure our spacers have stayed in place. The end result should be the axles held firmly in place, but we can still give it a little bit of wiggling back and forth. Before we put the motor back on, we want to verify the location of this coupler. Normally this will stay with the axle when you remove the axle, so we're going to need to take it off and transfer it to the new axle. If it stayed in the motor, it's probably a good idea to try to pull it out and instead put it on here, because it'll make it easier to connect the two. To get this off, probably going to need to use pliers, but we want to be careful not to damage it. So just grip it lightly, wiggle it a little bit to loosen it up, and eventually it slides right off. Now we're going to notice there's two pieces to this. There is the plastic, and then there is this little metal key, and this comes out. And when it goes into this slot right here. So we make sure the keyway is inside the plastic like this, and then we slide it onto the motor shaft and line it up so that keyway goes into the slot on the axle shaft. With the coupler on the axle itself, the motor should look like this, where there's nothing inside of there, no plastic. When you go to put the motor back on, you're going to want to look inside here and locate the oval hole and line it up with that coupler, which is also oval in shape. So you'll need to rotate the motor or the coupler itself until you can get the two to line up. Sometimes it's helpful if you just put it straight up and down and then rotate the motor until you can get it straight up and down, because it's hard to see in there while you're putting it in there. All right, once you get it to go on, now we're going to rotate the motor into its proper orientation. So this brake release lever should be somewhere close to here, and then we'll look for the bolt hole. We're going to take our mounting bolt, starting with the top, make sure this lock washer is in place, and we're going to go through here, and you can see the hole. You can kind of jiggle it around, rotate it until you get threaded in place. And we're going to go ahead and hand tighten this, leaving just a small gap so we have enough room to wiggle it around and get the bottom in. On the bottom, same thing. Make sure you have your lock washer, and you may have to wiggle the motor just to get it started. And it's hard to show you without my hand in the way, but we're going to hand tighten this as far as we can. So we're going to tighten the top bolt first, and we kind of pull up on the motor here to close that gap, and then we're going to tighten this almost all the way. Then we'll move to the bottom and tighten this, and now once both are tight, now we can really torque them down. These need to be super tight, just not tight enough where you end up breaking this off into there. You want to double check and make sure that your brake release lever can operate. It should be really close to this piece right here in the down position, but not actually touching. And now, once we're sure everything is good, we're going to go ahead and put the tires back on. When you're doing this, you want to make sure that these lug nuts go the right way. The beveled edge goes inwards. And it can be kind of difficult, believe it or not, to get these on properly. It's easy to tighten them down and have them offset. You kind of want to wiggle this tire around as you hand tighten. And then you do a diamond pattern. I usually do just one ooga dooga. And then you go back and pivot a little bit more. And done. So once you're sure everything's right, go ahead and pull the dolly back up to the upright position. Now we can turn it on and test it.